The fluorescent lights of the National Air and Space Museum cast long shadows across polished concrete as Jack Morrison stood before the aircraft. His hand trembled as it reached toward the fuselage fingers, stopping just short of the metal skin. 70 years old, silver hair thin against his spotted scalp, shoulders bent from decades of work in machine shops and factory floors. But his eyes were sharp, focused, fixed on the sleek Predator suspended before him. The Dornier Dome 335 Pfeil hung in the gallery like a frozen scream. Two propellers, one at the nose and one behind the cockpit, giving it a profile unlike anything else that ever flew. German engineering at its most desperate and most brilliant. A machine built when the Third Reich was bleeding aircraft faster than it could replace them, when every design had to be a miracle or nothing at all. Jack's grandson stood 3 feet behind him, 16 years old, with a new camera his parents bought for the trip to Washington. Rick had been filming everything, narrating into the microphone about monuments and museums and the grandfather he barely knew. But now the camera hung loose in his hands because something was wrong. His grandfather was crying. Not the quiet tears of an old man remembering lost time. Real crying, shoulders shaking, breath catching in his throat like a drowning man. "Rick, why are you crying?" The words came out uncertain, almost afraid. "Because boys don't see their grandfathers cry. Because men who survived the Depression and World War II and 60 years of American grit don't break down in museum galleries on a Tuesday morning in April 1988. Jack Morrison turned his head. Tears cut channels down his weathered cheeks. His voice came out rough, torn between decades. "Because I helped build this monster, Rick, and it saved a good man's life by arriving too late to kill anyone." The camera came back up, recording now. Because even at 16, Rick understood that something important was happening. That history was speaking through an old man's tears in front of a forgotten warplane. Jack's eyes returned to the cockpit. Through the canopy glass, he could see the instruments that controls the ejection seat that had been revolutionary in 1944. His vision blurred not from tears now, but from memory. The fluorescent museum lights became the harsh bulbs of a German factory at night. The smell of floor polish became machine oil and metal shavings and the acrid bite of welding smoke. He heard voices, German voices, laughter over terrible coffee made from roasted grain because real coffee didn't exist in the Third Reich anymore. The sound of drafting pencils on blueprint paper. The roar of a Daimler-Benz DB603 engine at full throttle felt in your chest and bones and teeth. And one voice in particular, accented English, careful and precise. A voice that taught him that engineering had no borders, that humanity could survive, even in hell, that enemies could become brothers if you let them. "Let me tell you about the fastest propeller plane of World War II. The words came out quietly, meant for his grandson, but carrying to the small crowd gathering nearby. "And the enemy who became my brother. If you or your family served during World War II, Jack continued, his voice steadier now, finding the rhythm of a story he'd kept silent for 43 years, especially in the European theater. This story might feel familiar. Drop a comment and share your connection to this era. He was talking to a camera now, to strangers, to a generation that barely remembered the war. But he was also talking to himself, to the young man he'd been in 1943, to the choices that man had made when the world was burning and the only thing that mattered was staying alive one more day. The story begins in Detroit, Motor City, 1940, before Pearl Harbor, before America knew it would be going to war at all. Morrison's machine shop on the east side, a brick building that smelled like cutting oil and coffee, where his father rebuilt engines for Ford and Chrysler and anyone else who could pay. Jack was 22 then, young and lean and hungry to understand how things worked. He'd spent his childhood in that shop learning to read the language of pistons and crankshafts, understanding that every machine had a logic, a personality, a soul if you knew where to look. His father was a practical man. German descended, ironically enough, though the family had been in Michigan for 3 generations. He'd taught Jack the most important lesson an engineer could learn, standing over a partially disassembled engine one Saturday afternoon. A good engineer respects the machine, Jack, not who builds it. German-American doesn't matter. If it's built right, it's built right. That lesson would save Jack's life. But first, it would complicate it in ways his father never imagined. By 1942, Jack had finished his degree in aeronautical engineering at the University of Michigan. He'd spent those years obsessed with aircraft design, particularly twin-engine configurations. He filled notebooks with sketches, calculations, theoretical improvements. One design kept recurring in his drawings. Two engines on the same center line, one pulling, one pushing. No asymmetric thrust if one engine failed. Reduced drag compared to wing-mounted engines. He'd written in the margin of one sketch in the confident hand of a student who thought he understood everything, "This is the future of aviation." He had no way of knowing that in a factory in southern Germany, a designer named Claude Dornier was thinking exactly the same thing. December 1941 brought Pearl Harbor. By March 1942, Jack had volunteered for the Army Air Corps. Not from patriotism particularly, though. He loved his country in the quiet way working-class boys from Detroit loved America. He volunteered because the Air Corps needed flight engineers, and he wanted to be close to the machines. He wanted to understand them in the air under stress in the environment they were built for. They assigned him to a B-17 Flying Fortress. 4 engines, 10 crew bristling with 50 caliber machine guns. The bomber that would win the war, they said. The plane that would bring the Third Reich to its knees. They called his plane Detroit Steel. The crew painted the name on the nose along with a cartoon of a fist punching through a swastika. Jack was the flight engineer, which meant he sat between the pilot and co-pilot monitoring 4 sets of gauges, watching temperatures and pressures and fuel flows, listening to the music of 4 Wright Cyclone engines at altitude. He was good at it, better than good. He could hear when an engine was running rough before the instruments showed a problem, could feel through the airframe when weight distribution was off. The pilot, a farm boy from Iowa named Patterson, said Jack understood that airplane like it was alive. And maybe it was. Maybe all machines are alive in the hands of someone who loves them. August 17th, 1943. A date burned into military history as Black Thursday, the Regensburg Raid. 146 B-17 tasked with bombing the Messerschmitt factory deep in southern Germany. Jack's plane in the formation, Detroit Steel, carrying 2 tons of high explosive toward a target 400 miles inside enemy territory. The mission briefing had been grim. No fighter escort for the full distance. German fighters would swarm them. Flak would be heavy. Expect losses. They didn't mention that losses would be catastrophic. That 24 aircraft wouldn't come home. That the sky over Germany would be filled with burning metal and falling men, and the obscene beauty of parachutes blooming white against blue. Jack remembered the approach to Regensburg. The way his stomach tightened as the flak started. Black puffs of smoke appearing around the formation like evil flowers. The sound of shrapnel hitting aluminum skin, a rain of metal fragments that could kill you or pass through harmlessly depending on angles measured in degrees. He remembered German fighters coming in Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek and deadly and fast. The bombers' guns hammering away spent shells cascading through the interior. The co-pilot, a kid from Pennsylvania, just 20 years old, hit in the shoulder by a 20-millimeter cannon round. And through all of it, through the terror and chaos and the certain knowledge that he might die, in the next 5 seconds, Jack found himself fascinated by the German fighters. The way they moved, the precision of their attacks, the elegant brutality of their engineering. They were beautiful machines. He understood that even as they tried to kill him. The bomb run was successful. Detroit Steel dropped its payload and turned for home with the rest of the formation. 400 miles back to England. 400 miles of fuel calculations and navigation, and hoping the German fighters had exhausted their ammunition. They almost made it. Somewhere over Bavaria with England, maybe 200 miles away, and safety close enough to taste, the German fighters came back for one more pass. A Bf-109 made a perfect deflection shot from 7 o'clock high. Jack never saw him coming. The number 3 engine exploded. Not just failed, but exploded in a spray of oil and flame and shredded metal. The propeller tore free and spun away. Fire streamed back along the wing. Patterson fought the controls. Feathered the prop on engine 3. Hit the fire suppression. The flames died, but the engine was gone. 3 engines left, one of them damaged. They could make it. Jack knew the numbers. The B-17 could fly on 3 engines, even 2, if you were desperate and skilled. They could make it. Then the number 4 engine started losing oil pressure. Jack watched the gauge drop, watched the temperature climb. called out the numbers to Patterson while his mind raced through calculations and possibilities and prayers to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. The number 4 engine seized. The propeller froze. Suddenly they were a heavy bomber on 2 engines losing altitude over enemy territory with 60 miles still to friendly lines. Patterson looked at Jack. Jack looked at the altimeters and the rate of descent and the distance remaining. Did the math that every engineer learns to do. The math that tells you when a situation has moved from dangerous to impossible. Patterson's voice came through the intercom calm and professional, like they'd trained him, like this was just another drill. Bail out! Bail out! Everyone out now! Jack pulled the co-pilot from his seat, the kid barely conscious, blood soaking through his flight suit, helped him to the forward escape hatch. Watched him drop through into nothing, his parachute opening a few seconds later. One by one the crew went out. The navigator, the bombardier, the radio operator, the waist gunners, the tail gunner. Patterson looked at Jack. Jack looked at the instruments one last time at the gauges telling the story of a dying machine. Then he jumped. The slipstream caught him like a fist, spun him, tumbled him through thin air 8,000 feet above Bavaria. He pulled the ripcord and felt the opening shock as the parachute deployed. The harness straps bit into his shoulders and thighs. The noise of the wind stopped and suddenly there was just silence and the gentle swaying descent and the sound of his own breathing. Below him, Detroit steel spiraled down, trailing smoke. He watched it fall, this machine he'd cared for and understood and loved, in the way engineers love machines. Watched it spin and spiral, and finally impact in a Bavarian field with a flash and a sound that reached him 3 seconds later. His last thought before hitting the ground was absurd and mundane and so perfectly Jack Morrison that he would remember it for the rest of his life. Dad's gonna kill me for wrecking a perfectly good airplane. He landed hard in a wheat field, rolled badly, felt something twist in his ankle, lay there for 30 seconds, breathing alive, staring at blue sky and wondering if he was the only one from Detroit Steel who'd made it out. The Wehrmacht soldiers found him in less than 20 minutes. 4 of them teenagers, mostly looking tired and scared, and just as ready for the war to be over as anyone else. They took his sidearm and his survival kit and helped him to his feet with surprising gentleness. One of them spoke broken English, asked if he was hurt. Jack shook his head, asked about his crew. The German shrugged, some parachutes, maybe 2, 3 alive, maybe more. They walked him to a road where a truck waited, other prisoners already inside. Jack recognized the tail gunner from Detroit Steel, a kid from Chicago named Rodriguez. They locked eyes but didn't speak. What was there to say? The truck drove them to a processing center, then to Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe's interrogation facility for captured airmen. Not a prison camp yet, just a holding area where they separated officers from enlisted men and tried to extract information about targets and tactics and squadron strength. Jack's interrogation was different. The Luftwaffe officer who questioned him was older, maybe 50, with the bearing of a man who'd flown in the First War. He spoke perfect English with a British accent, probably learned at Oxford or Cambridge before the world went mad. He looked at Jack's personnel file at the education level and the specialty training. You're an engineer, not just a flight engineer. You have a degree. You understand aircraft systems at a level beyond operational. Jack said nothing. Name, rank, serial number. That's all the Geneva Convention required. The officer smiled, not unkindly. I'm not asking about your missions, Captain Morrison. I'm not interested in your bomb loads or your target lists. I'm interested in your skills. He pushed a photograph across the desk. A factory complex, large buildings with smokestacks, railroad sidings. Do you know what this is? Jack stayed silent. This is Friedrichshafen on Lake Constance. There is a company there called Dornier. They make aircraft, very advanced aircraft. They have need of technical consultants. The officer leaned back in his chair. You'll work or you'll starve in a standard POW camp. The choice is yours. But consider this, in a camp, you're a number. You eat turnip soup and wait for the war to end, assuming you live that long. At Friedrichshafen, you're an engineer. You do what you love. You survive. Jack's mind raced. Collaboration. Working for the enemy. His father's voice in his head, respect the machine, not who builds it, but surely that didn't extend to building machines for Nazi Germany. But the alternative was a camp. Starvation, disease, possibly death. He heard himself ask, "What kind of work?" The officer smiled again. "Aircraft manufacturing. There's a designer there with ambitious ideas. Push-pull engine configuration. Revolutionary if it works." Something in Jack's chest tightened. Push-pull configuration. The design he'd sketched in his notebooks at Michigan. The future of aviation. Someone in Germany had actually built it. The officer must have seen something in Jack's face because he nodded slowly. "I thought that might interest you, Captain Morrison. You'll leave tomorrow." That night in his cell, Jack stared at the ceiling and tried to convince himself he wasn't betraying anything. He was a prisoner. He had no choice. Working to survive wasn't collaboration. But he knew even then that he was lying to himself. Because part of him, the engineer part, the part that loved machines more than flags or politics, wanted to see that push-pull configuration. Wanted to understand how they'd solve the problems he'd only theorized about. Wanted to know if it actually worked. September 1943. Late morning. The truck rumbled south through Germany toward Lake Constance in the town of Friedrichshafen. Jack sat in the back with 7 other prisoners, all Allied aircrew, all with technical backgrounds. A British engineer who'd worked on Lancasters, a Canadian navigator with a mathematics degree, an American bombardier who'd taught physics before the war. They didn't speak much. What was there to say? They were prisoners being taken to work in an enemy factory. Collaborators by necessity, survivors by choice. The Dornier factory complex sprawled along the lakeshore. Massive buildings, guard towers, fencing topped with wire. It looked like every other German military facility Jack had seen in reconnaissance photos, grim and utilitarian, and built for a single purpose. But inside it was different. The guards were Wehrmacht, not SS. Older men mostly too old for frontline service. They handled the prisoners roughly, but without particular cruelty. Bureaucratic violence, not ideological hate. They were processed and assigned to barracks. 8 men to a room, thin mattresses, 1 stove. It was September and still warm, but winter was coming, and Jack tried not to think about how cold this room would be in January. In the morning, they were taken to the factory floor. A massive space filled with machine tools and welding stations and partially assembled aircraft in various stages of completion. The smell hit Jack immediately. Metal and oil and solvents, and the particular scent of aluminum shavings that every aircraft factory shared. For the first time since his capture, he felt something like calm. This was a space he understood. These were machines he spoke to. Whatever else happened, whatever moral compromises he was making, at least he was back in the world of engineering. A British prisoner, older than Jack, maybe 40, leaned close and whispered, "They're building something mad here. Look at the drawings." Jack looked, saw blueprints pinned to boards, saw the profile of an aircraft unlike anything he'd ever encountered. 2 engines, yes, push. Pull. Configuration, yes, but the execution was brilliant. The rear propeller behind the cockpit, the tricycle landing gear to prevent prop strike, the slim fuselage optimized for speed. "My God," Jack whispered back. "Someone actually figured it out." The British engineer nodded grimly. "And we're going to help them finish it. God help us all." They put Jack on landing gear systems. Apparently someone had decided his skills were best suited to structural calculations and stress analysis. He worked at a drafting table with 3 German engineers, none of whom spoke English, communicating through drawings and numbers, and the universal language of mathematics. For 2 weeks he worked and ate and slept and tried not to think too hard about what he was doing. Tried to focus on the problems, the equations, the elegant beauty of a well-designed strut or actuator or shock absorber. Then in early October, he met Hans Weber. The chief test pilot came through the engineering section on a routine inspection. Jack noticed him immediately because everyone else did. The German engineer straightened, showed respect. This wasn't a military officer. This was something more important. The man who would actually fly what they were building. Hans Weber was 32 years old, tall and angular, with dark hair already graying at the temples. He wore coveralls like the other engineers, but moved with the physical confidence of a pilot. Someone whose body understood 3-dimensional space in ways that ground-bound humans never would. He stopped at Jack's table, looked at the landing gear drawings Jack had been working on, spoke in careful, precise English. "You're the American engineer." Jack looked up, met gray eyes that held neither hostility nor friendship. Just professional assessment. POW engineer. Hans nodded slowly. Same thing to me. Can you tell me if this strut will hold 21,000 pounds? It was the last question Jack expected. Not who are you or why should I trust you or any of the personal questions. Just a technical problem. A number that needed verification. Jack pulled the drawings closer, ran the calculations in his head, checking the math the German engineers had already done. Found a small error in the stress distribution analysis. Not as designed, you'll get micro-fractures at the attachment point after maybe 50 hard landings. Redistribute the load here and here, it'll hold. Hans studied the drawing where Jack had marked corrections, nodded again. You're right, I'll have them modify it. He started to turn away, then stopped, looked back at Jack. I learned my English from American aviation magazines. I've read about your aircraft design philosophy. Your engineers think differently than ours, sometimes better. Jack didn't know what to say to that. It felt like a trap. Or maybe it was just honesty. Hans seemed to read his confusion because something that might have been a smile touched his face. I joined the Nazi Party to keep this factory from SS control, to protect the workers here. I don't believe in anything except keeping good people alive and building machines that work. If you're wondering whether you can trust me, the answer is conditional. I'll be honest about engineering. Everything else is complicated. Then he walked away, leaving Jack staring at his back and trying to process what had just happened. Over the next 3 weeks, Hans returned to Jack's station repeatedly, always with technical questions, always treating Jack like a colleague rather than a prisoner or enemy. They discussed stress calculations and control surface design and the endless problem of the rear propeller. Jack learned that Hans had a degree in aeronautical engineering from Berlin, that he'd worked for Dornier since 1936, that he'd been forced to join the party in 1942 when the SS started taking control of aviation factories, and he'd made a choice between compromise and irrelevance. It wasn't much, brief conversations in the margin of work, but it was enough for Jack to start seeing Hans as a person rather than a symbol, and that made everything more complicated. Late October, night shift. Most of the factory was dark, but the engineering section stayed lit, working around the clock to meet impossible deadlines. Jack was alone at his table when Hans appeared, carrying a rolled blueprint and 2 tin cups of what passed for coffee in wartime Germany. He set one cup in front of Jack, unrolled the blueprint. The ejection system for the WWII. I need your help with a problem that could kill me. Jack looked at the design, saw the issue immediately. The rear propeller directly in the ejection path. Any pilot trying to bail out would be cut in half before his parachute could deploy. Hans pointed to a proposed solution. Explosive charges to blow the tail section and rear propeller free before ejection. In theory it worked. In practice, there were 100 ways it could fail. They spent 4 hours that night working through the math, the timing sequences, the charge placement, the backup systems. By dawn, they had a design that might work. That should work if everything went perfectly. Hans sat back exhausted, picked up his cold coffee and drank it anyway. Thank you, Jack nodded, too tired for words. Hans pulled out his wallet, extracted a small photograph. A woman and a young girl, maybe 8 years old, standing in a garden somewhere. My wife and daughter. Hamburg. He put the photograph on the table between them. If I don't fly this plane successfully, if I can't prove it works, my family loses protection status. Hamburg is being bombed regularly now. Civilians are dying. My daughter, she's just a little girl. The SS has special schools for children of discredited party members. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Jack understood. Understood that Hans wasn't asking for help because of patriotism or ideology. He was asking as a father trying to keep his child safe in a world gone insane. Hans continued, his voice quiet but steady. Help me solve this, American. Not for Germany, not for the Reich. For a little girl who shouldn't die because her father couldn't make a machine work. Jack looked at the photograph, at the small face smiling up at a camera, unaware that she was a pawn in games of state and war that cared nothing for individual lives. He thought about his own family in Detroit, his father in the machine shop, his mother who wrote letters he'd never received now, the world he'd left behind that felt impossibly distant. He thought about what his father had taught him. Respect the machine, Build it right or don't build it at all. He heard himself say, I'll help you. Hans looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and put the photograph back in his wallet. After the war, he said quietly, come to Stuttgart. My wife makes the best coffee in Germany. Real coffee, not this. Jack almost laughed. You think there'll be an after? Hans met his eyes. There has to be. Otherwise, what's the point of keeping each other alive? And that was how it began. An American prisoner and a German test pilot building an ejection system for a revolutionary aircraft in the dying days of a regime neither of them believed in. Building it not for victory or glory or any cause larger than themselves. Building it to keep one man alive, to protect one little girl in Hamburg, to preserve some small fragment of humanity in a world determined to destroy it. Jack Morrison stood in the National Air and Space Museum in 1988, 45 years later, and remembered that moment. Remembered Hans Weber's face across a drafting table. Remembered making a choice that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. Remembered learning that sometimes the only moral choice is an immoral one. That survival is complicated, that enemies can become brothers if you're desperate enough and honest enough and human enough to let them. The Do-3, 3-5, hung above him, silent and deadly and beautiful. A machine too fast for the war that birthed it. A bridge between enemies. A testament to what humans can build together when everything else is falling apart. Rick lowered his camera. Grandpa, what happened next? Jack wiped his eyes. Turned to face his grandson and the small crowd that had gathered. What happened next, he said quietly, is that we built something that saved both our lives by arriving too late to take anyone else's. But that's a longer story. And first you need to understand just how desperate Germany had become. How close the world came to seeing this predator in the skies in numbers that might have changed everything. November came to southern Germany with cold rain and early darkness. The factory windows fogged with condensation from the heat of welding torches and the breath of men working through the night. Jack Morrison had been at Friedrichshafen for 6 weeks now, and the moral weight of what he was doing had settled into his bones like the damp chill that never quite left the barracks. But the work itself was intoxicating. The ejection system problem consumed him. Every spare moment, every hour Hans could steal from his test flight schedule, they worked on the math. The explosive charges had to blow the tail section free in exact sequence. Too slow and the pilot hit the propeller. Too fast and the separation might damage the aircraft structure in a way that compromised the ejection trajectory. The timing window was measured in hundredths of a second. It was the kind of problem that made Jack forget where he was, made him forget he was a prisoner in an enemy factory building a weapon that might kill his countrymen. When he was deep in the calculations, pencil moving across paper, it was just engineering. Pure and clean and untouched by politics or war or the ugly compromises of survival. Hans understood this. Maybe that's why they worked well together. Two men who loved machines more than they loved anything else, finding refuge in numbers and stress calculations and the elegant logic of physics. Late one evening in mid-November, with the night shift winding down, and most of the German engineers gone home to whatever remained of their families, Hans appeared at Jack's station carrying something wrapped in cloth. Jack looked up from a blueprint. Hans unwrapped the cloth to reveal black bread, a small piece of hard cheese, and what might have been sausage but was probably some wartime substitute made from things Jack didn't want to think about. We need to eat, Hans said simply. The problem will still be hereafter. They sat at the drafting table, this odd tableau of captor and prisoner engineer, an engineer sharing a meal that would have been inadequate even before the war and was borderline starvation now. Hans poured 2 tin cups of coffee from a thermos. Jack took a sip and immediately regretted it. This is terrible. Hans actually laughed, a short bark of sound that seemed surprised to escape his throat. This is not coffee. This is roasted grain and chicory and desperation. But after the war you come to Stuttgart, to my house. My wife makes real coffee, the best in Germany. Jack chewed the bread, which was dense and sour and probably more sawdust than flour. Stuttgart, after the war, as if such a thing was possible, as if they would survive this and meet again as something other than prisoner and guard. You really think there will be an after? Jack asked, again echoing their earlier conversation. Hans was quiet for a moment, staring into his cup of fake coffee. When he spoke, his voice was softer than Jack had heard before. There has to be. Otherwise, we are just building more efficient ways to destroy each other. Otherwise, my daughter grows up in a world where the only skill that matters is killing. I have to believe there's an after. That someday she'll be old enough to ask me what I did in the war, and I can tell her I kept people alive. That I built something beautiful, even if it was supposed to be deadly. Jack thought about that, about building something beautiful that was supposed to be deadly, about the strange morality of designing landing gear and ejection systems that might save one life, while the machine as a whole was meant to take others. We're not so different, Jack said finally. We both just want to build something that flies. Hans nodded slowly. And maybe that's enough. In a world going mad, maybe that small thing is enough. They finished their meal in silence, then returned to the blueprints, to the careful dance of numbers and physics, to the problem of keeping a man alive when everything around him was designed for death. By January 1944, they had a solution. The explosive charge system would blow the tail section and rear propeller free in a precisely timed sequence. Backup detonators in case the primary failed. A manual override in case the electrical system was damaged. It was elegant. It was fail-safe as anything could be in the chaos of aerial combat. It might actually work. Hans studied the final design for a long time, then looked up at Jack with something that might have been respect or gratitude or the recognition that they'd crossed a line from which there was no return. You saved my life before I even took off, he said quietly. Jack wanted to say something about how he'd saved himself too, how this work had given him purpose and kept him from the slow death of a regular POW camp. But the words stuck in his throat because they both knew the truth. Jack had helped build a weapons system for Nazi Germany, had used his training, his skill, his American education to make a German fighter more survivable. It didn't matter that his intentions were good. It didn't matter that he was a prisoner. History wouldn't care about those nuances. I just did the math, Jack said finally. Hans smiled sadly. We both know it's more than that. But I'll let you believe it if it helps you sleep. February 1944 brought news that changed everything. The factory commander assembled the entire workforce, German and prisoner alike, in the main hangar. An officer from Berlin stood on a platform reading from official orders. Production quotas, delivery schedules, aircraft assignments. 120 Do 335 fighters to be produced at Friedrichshafen. 2,000 more from the Munich facility at Oberpfaffenhofen. Completion date March 1946. The numbers were staggering. Impossible, really, given the state of German industry. But the orders were clear. The Do 335 had been designated a priority aircraft. Resources would be allocated. Workers would be found. The Pfeil the Arrow would be mass-produced. Jack stood in that crowd and felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. 120 aircraft. If even half of them made it to operational squadrons, if they performed as the test data suggested, they would be devastating. Faster than any Allied fighter. Heavily armed, with range enough to escort bombers or run down reconnaissance planes or intercept raids deep into Germany. He had helped make this possible. After the assembly, Jack found Hans near the prototype hangar. The test pilot was staring at the sleek shape of the V1, the first flyable Do 335, its twin props glinting in the weak winter sunlight coming through the hangar doors. It's too late, Hans said without turning. The war is already lost. Production facilities are being bombed. Raw materials are scarce. Experienced pilots are dead or captured. They'll never build 2,000 of these. They'll be lucky to build 20. Then why go through with it? Hans finally looked at him. Because if I don't, someone else flies the test flights. And they won't have landing gear designed by the best engineer I know. They won't have an ejection system that might actually work. They'll die in an airplane that wasn't ready, and their deaths will be meaningless. It was the logic of survival in a dying regime. Build it right because building it wrong kills people. Fly it because if you don't, someone less skilled dies instead. Keep going because stopping means giving up the last fragments of control in a world spinning toward chaos. Jack understood, didn't like it, couldn't argue with it, understood. The factory shifted to a wartime footing that was already beyond wartime. 24-hour shifts, 7 days a week, meals at the workstation, sleep in shifts. The sound of machinery never stopped. The smell of welding and solvents and exhaustion permeated everything. Jack worked until his hands cramped and his eyes blurred. Worked because what else was there to do? Worked because the alternative was thinking too hard about the moral calculus of his situation, and that way lay madness. In March, Allied bombers hit Stuttgart 50 miles away. They could hear the explosions from Friedrichshafen, a distant thunder that lasted hours. Hans said nothing when he arrived at the factory the next morning, but his face was gray, and he moved like a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. Jack wanted to ask if his family was safe, but couldn't find words that didn't sound like mockery or pity or the twisted sympathy of helping someone, while his country tried to kill that person's family. They worked side by side that day without speaking. Sometimes silence was the only honest communication left. By spring, the moral weight of collaboration caught up with Jack in a way he couldn't ignore. The British engineer who'd first shown him the WWII plans, a man named Thomas who'd flown Lancasters before being shot down over the Ruhr, cornered Jack in the barracks one evening. "You're Morrison, right? The one working with the German test pilot." Jack nodded, wary. Thomas's face was hard. "You know you're a collaborator." The word hung in the air like poison gas. Collaborator. The worst thing you could call a POW. Worse than traitor because it implied choice agency willing participation in the enemy's war effort. "I'm trying to stay alive," Jack said carefully. Thomas stepped closer. "We're all trying to stay alive, mate. But most of us aren't helping them build better fighters. Fighters that'll kill Allied pilots. Boys from England and America and Canada who are doing what we should have done. Fighting. I'm keeping a man alive," Jack said, hearing the defensive edge in his own voice. "That man will kill Allied pilots with the weapon you're building. Maybe. Or maybe the war ends before he flies it in combat. I'm betting on the latter." Thomas shook his head in disgust. "You're betting with other people's lives, Morrison. And when this is over, when we go home, you'll have to explain why you worked so hard for the Germans. Why you gave them your engineering skills when you could have refused. Could have taken your punishment and kept your conscience clean." Jack felt anger rise in his throat. Clean conscience. You think starving in a camp is morally superior? You think dying of typhus or dysentery or a guard's bullet makes you a hero? It makes you not a collaborator. The words hit like a physical blow. Because Thomas was right in a way. Jack had made a choice, had chosen survival and interesting work over the harder path of resistance or refusal, had chosen to respect the machine over loyalty to the flag. "I'm doing what I think is right," Jack said finally. Thomas laughed, bitter and cold. "That's what every collaborator says." He walked away, leaving Jack alone with thoughts that circled like vultures. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. Lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of other prisoners breathing and snoring, and occasionally crying out in their sleep. Thought about what he'd done, what he was doing, what it meant. He'd helped design an ejection system that might save Hans Weber's life, but that system was part of an aircraft designed to kill. Every hour Jack spent making the WWII better, safer, more survivable was an hour spent making it more effective as a weapon. The math didn't lie. The moral calculus was brutally simple. He was helping the enemy, but Hans wasn't the enemy. Hans was a father trying to protect his daughter, an engineer who loved machines, a man trapped by the same war, the same impossible choices, the same desperate attempt to preserve humanity in a world designed to destroy it. If nations were the enemy, if ideologies and governments and political systems were what you fought, then maybe Thomas was right. But if people were what mattered, if individual lives had value beyond their utility to state power, then maybe keeping Hans alive was worth the compromise. Jack didn't sleep that night, didn't come to any conclusions that satisfied him. Just lay there until dawn trying to convince himself he was still a good man. October 26th, 1943, a date that would burn itself into Jack Morrison's memory with the clarity of trauma. The morning broke cold and clear over Friedrichshafen. Perfect flying weather. Hans had been scheduled for the first full power test flight of the V1 prototype. All previous flights had been cautious, building up speeds and altitudes, gradually testing systems one at a time. Today was different. Today, Hans would push the WWII to its limits. Full throttle on both engines. Maximum altitude. Dive tests to verify the airframe could handle the stresses. This was the flight that would prove whether the revolutionary design actually worked or was just an elegant failure? Jack stood with the German ground crew near the runway. He wasn't supposed to be there. Prisoners were meant to stay in the factory during test flights. But Hans had quietly arranged for him to observe because Hans understood that Jack needed to see what they'd built together. Needed to know if the landing gear and ejection system would hold when tested for real. The WWII sat on the tarmac morning sun, glinting off its aluminum skin. Sleek and predatory and unlike anything else on Earth. Two propellers nose and tail, giving it a profile that looked wrong until you understood the physics. Then it looked inevitable. Hans walked toward the aircraft flight suit and parachute leather helmet under his arm. He caught Jack's eye across the distance and nodded once. No words, just acknowledgement. We built this together. Now let's see if it kills me. The engine started with a roar that Jack felt in his chest. The front engine, first a Daimler-Benz DB603 at full song 12 cylinders and 1,800 horsepower, turning the propeller into a blur. Then the rear engine spun up, adding its own thunder, and suddenly the WWII sounded like something that could tear the sky apart. Hans taxied to the runway. The tricycle landing gear they'd designed, the gear Jack had calculated stress loads for rolling smooth and true. The tower cleared him for takeoff. The engine note rose to a scream. The WWII accelerated down the runway faster than any aircraft Jack had seen before. The nose lifted, the main gear came off the ground, and then it was climbing like it wanted to reach space, clawing for altitude, with a rate of ascent that defied physics and common sense, and everything Jack thought he knew about aircraft performance. Beautiful, one of the German engineers breathed beside him. Jack could only nod. It was beautiful. Terrible and beautiful, and proof that sometimes desperate times bred desperate genius instead of desperate failure. Hans took the prototype through its paces for 40 minutes. Climbs and dives. Turns at various speeds and altitudes. Testing control response engine performance structural limits. From the ground, Jack watched it through binoculars, following every move, analyzing every maneuver, like he could keep the aircraft safe through sheer force of will. Everything was perfect. Until 15,000 feet, when it wasn't. Jack saw the smoke first. A dark trail streaming from the rear of the aircraft. Not engine exhaust. Actual smoke. Something burning or leaking or failing. The radio on the ground crackled to life. Hans's voice calm and professional and absolutely terrifying in its control. Ground, this is Weber. Rear engine coolant failure. Smoke in cockpit. Visibility compromised. Evaluating situation. Jack's blood turned to ice. Coolant failure meant overheating. Overheating meant potential fire. Fire in an aircraft meant seconds to live if you couldn't stop it. The ground controller responded in German rapid-fire questions. Engine temperature, oil pressure, flame visible, or just smoke? Hans answered each query with the mechanical precision of a test pilot doing his job even as he was potentially seconds from death. Rear engine temperature critical. Shutting down, evaluating ejection necessity. Jack stopped breathing. Ejection. The system they designed together, never tested with a live pilot, never proven beyond mathematical models and small-scale prototypes. If Hans ejected and the explosive charges failed, if the timing was wrong, if any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong did go wrong, Hans Weber would be cut in half by his own propeller. The German ground crew was shouting at each other. Emergency protocols. Fire trucks rolling toward the runway. Someone praying in rapid German. Jack just watched through the binoculars, helpless, seeing Hans in the cockpit through the canopy glass. Seeing him make the calculation every pilot makes in an emergency. The math of survival. Can I save the aircraft? Can I save myself? How many seconds do I have to decide? The smoke was getting worse. Darker. More of it. Then Hans's voice again, steady as bedrock. Coolant leak contained. Fire suppression activated. Shutting down rear engine. Attempting single engine landing. Single engine landing. The WWII had never landed on one engine before. The performance charts suggested it was possible, but charts in reality were different countries with different laws. Jack watched the descent. Hans brought the nose up slightly, bleeding off speed, configuring for approach with only the front propeller pulling. The aircraft flew awkwardly, unbalanced, the dead rear engine, a weight that changed every flying characteristic. But it flew. Hans lined up for the runway. Too fast, Jack thought. The airspeed was high, probably because Hans didn't trust the single engine to maintain flight at approach speed. Better to hit the runway fast than to stall short and crash in the field before it. The wheels touched. Hard. The nose gear compressed more than it should have, the struts, bending under load that exceeded design specifications. Jack heard himself praying in a voice he didn't recognize. Hold. Hold. Please hold. The rear gear took the weight. The struts that Jack had calculated, that he'd spent weeks analyzing and redesigning, absorbed the impact. Metal stressed to its limits, but not beyond. Engineering holding against physics by the narrowest margin. The WWII rolled down the runway, trailing smoke, slowing, finally coming to rest 500 feet before the end. The fire trucks roared toward it. Hans popped the canopy and climbed out, moving quickly, but not panicking, as smoke poured from the rear engine compartment. He stood on the wing for a moment, watching the fire crew spray foam on the smoking engine. Then he dropped to the ground and walked toward where Jack stood with the German crew. Hans was covered in soot and sweat. His hands were shaking just slightly, the only sign of what he'd just been through. He stopped in front of Jack, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other. "Your calculations were perfect," Hans said quietly. "The gear held at 22,000 pounds over specification. You kept me alive, American." Jack felt something break open in his chest, relief and horror and the weight of responsibility all at once. He'd helped build this weapon, but he'd also saved this man. Both things were true. Both things mattered. The moral calculus didn't resolve into anything clean or simple. "I helped build a weapon," Jack heard himself say. Hans shook his head slowly. "No, you helped save a life. There's a difference, and maybe, in this madness, maybe that's all we can do. Build things that preserve instead of destroy, create instead of annihilate. Keep small pieces of humanity alive in the wreckage." It was the closest either of them would come to acknowledging the strange bond they'd formed. Engineer to engineer, prisoner to captor, human to human. Two men trying to do something decent in a world that had forgotten decency was possible. The Reich's aviation ministry investigated the coolant failure, found a manufacturing defect in one of the cooling system seals. Not a design flaw, just bad luck in wartime quality control. They fixed it and ordered Hans to resume test flights as soon as the V1 was repaired. By late 1944, winter settling in hard and cold, the broader context of the WWII program became impossible to ignore. Production was a disaster. The 120 aircraft ordered for Friedrichshafen had become 20, then 15, then 11. Raw materials were scarce. The bombing campaign was intensifying. Skilled workers were being conscripted for last-ditch infantry units. The machinery needed for precision manufacturing was breaking down faster than it could be repaired. Worse, the Heinkel factory that was supposed to shift production from the He-219 night fighter to the WWII refused to comply. Ernst Heinkel, the company head, had quietly ignored the orders, keeping his workers on the night fighter program because it used the same Daimler-Benz B603 engines the Do-335 needed. Every He-219 that rolled off the Heinkel production line was one less engine available for the Pfeil. A bureaucratic war within the larger war played out in production quotas and material allocation and the petty power struggles of dying regime. Hans told Jack about all this one night in the factory. They'd reached a point where they could talk openly about the Reich's collapse. Everyone knew it was coming. The only question was when and how much destruction would precede the end. "We're not going to make the production numbers," Hans said, studying a spreadsheet that showed the gap between promised deliveries and reality. "The war will end before we deliver enough aircraft to matter. Maybe 11 completed, maybe 15 if we're lucky." Jack felt a complicated swirl of emotions, relief that fewer of these deadly machines would reach operational squadrons. Disappointment that all their work, all the engineering brilliance would amount to almost nothing. And underneath it all, a growing hope that maybe he'd been right. Maybe the war would end before Hans ever fired the Do-335's guns in anger. "Is that good or bad?" Jack asked. Hans was quiet for a long moment. "For Germany, bad. The Reich is finished. But for you and me, maybe the best thing that could happen. I won't have to kill your countrymen. You won't have to live with knowing you helped me do it. We can both tell ourselves we were just engineers, just men trying to survive. It was a comfortable lie. They both knew it. But comfortable lies were all they had left. January 1945 brought the final phase. The war's endgame. Soviet forces pushing from the east. American and British armies from the west. German cities burning. The infrastructure of the state collapsing. And still the WWII program continued. 11 aircraft completed. A handful more in various stages of assembly. Test flights ongoing. Hans flew almost daily now, gathering data that would never be analyzed, writing reports that no one would read, maintaining the fiction that the program mattered. Then in February, Hans received new orders. He found Jack in the factory late one evening, handed him a sheet of paper without comment. Official Wehrmacht Aviation Command letterhead. Assignment to operational duties. Combat patrol. The DO-335 was being deployed to frontline reconnaissance missions. Hans was finally going to fight. Jack stared at the orders, feeling the world shift under his feet. All the moral calculations, all the justifications about keeping one man alive, about building something beautiful in the wreckage of war came down to this moment. Hans Weber was going to take the aircraft they'd built together and potentially use it to kill Allied pilots. When Jack managed, next week, they want combat evaluation data, want to know if the speed advantage is real. Jack couldn't find words. What do you say to someone you've kept alive who's about to try to kill your countrymen? Hans seemed to understand. I'm going to fly, Jack. Fighting, we'll see. Speed means I can choose my engagements. Choose to evade instead of attack. The war's almost over. Why kill someone now when it doesn't matter? It was thin reassurance. In combat, choices narrowed. Survival instinct took over. Training and adrenaline and split-second decisions that couldn't be analyzed or judged until after. But it was all the reassurance either of them could offer. Jack Morrison stood beside Hans Weber in a German aircraft factory in February 1945 and understood that they'd reached the end of something. The strange alliance born of necessity and mutual respect and shared love of machines was about to collide with the reality they'd been avoiding. The war was coming for them, and neither engineering skill, nor moral complexity, nor careful rationalization would protect them from what happened next. Part of the story was ending. The comfortable part where they could pretend they were just engineers building something beautiful. The hard part was beginning. The part where their creation would be tested not in controlled flights over Bavaria, but in the chaos of aerial combat, where all their careful work would either save lives or take them, where Jack would have to confront whether keeping one man alive was worth the cost of what that man might do. They didn't shake hands, didn't say goodbye, just stood there in the factory's dim light, two men on opposite sides of history who'd found common ground in mathematics and engineering and the stubborn belief that humanity could survive even here, even now. But survival, they were about to learn, was only the beginning. What you did with that survival, how you used the life you'd preserved, that was where the real moral reckoning waited. And it was coming faster than either of them imagined. April 15th, 1945. The date would be recorded in combat reports and intelligence files in the memories of men who flew Hawker Tempests over southern Germany. But for Jack Morrison and Hans Weber, it would mean something different. Something that validated every choice they'd made, every compromise they'd lived with, every hour spent building a machine designed to kill, but destined for something else entirely. Hans took off from a dispersed airfield near Munich in the early morning. The Do-335 he flew was one of 11 completed aircraft bearing the weight of 2 years of engineering millions of Reichsmarks in the desperate hope that revolutionary design could somehow turn the tide of a war already lost. Jack watched from the factory. They'd moved most operations to Oberpfaffenhofen after Friedrichshafen was deemed too vulnerable to bombing. He wasn't supposed to know the flight schedule, wasn't supposed to care. But Hans had quietly told him the night before a simple statement of fact that carried the weight of goodbye. I fly reconnaissance tomorrow. Southern sector. The orders are to observe and report, not engage unless necessary. What does necessary mean? Jack had asked. Hans had smiled sadly. In this war, whatever lets me come home alive. Now Jack stood near the factory windows, supposedly working on technical drawings, but actually watching the sky. Watching and waiting and trying not to think about what would happen if Hans encountered Allied fighters. If necessity forced engagement, If the aircraft they'd built together became the weapon it was always meant to be. 200 miles away, Pierre Klosterman was leading 4 Hawker Tempests on patrol near the Austrian border. 24 years old French ace flying for the RAF with multiple kills and a reputation for aggressive tactics. The Tempest was fast for its time, capable of 435 miles per hour in level flight. One of the quickest propeller-driven fighters the Allies had. It should have been fast enough. Klosterman saw the German aircraft first, low and fast, hugging the terrain, a profile he didn't recognize. Not a Messerschmitt, not a Focke-Wulf, something else. Something moving at a speed that seemed impossible for a propeller-driven machine. He called out the contact. 2 of his wingmen broke to pursue. Standard tactical procedure. Run down the enemy, engage, destroy. Hans in the WWII cockpit, 3,000 feet above the ground, saw the Tempest climbing toward him, felt his heartbeat accelerate, felt his hands tighten on the controls. This was the moment. Combat. The thing he'd been trained for and dreaded and avoided for 2 years while building this machine. He could engage. The WWII was faster, more heavily armed. The Tempests were already struggling to gain altitude, their pilots pushing engines to combat power-burning fuel at unsustainable rates just to close the distance. Hans thought about Jack Morrison in a factory watching the sky. Thought about a little girl in Hamburg who'd survived the war so far because her father had kept flying. Thought about all the Allied pilots who were someone's son, someone's father, someone's friend. The war was over. They just didn't know it yet. He pushed both throttles forward. The Daimler-Benz engines responded with a surge of power that pressed him back in his seat. 470 miles per hour. 480. The WWII accelerated like it was falling down a cliff made of sky. The Tempest fell behind. Klosterman watched it happen with the clarity of a professional, recognizing something beyond his capability. The German aircraft wasn't running away, it was simply leaving, moving at a speed that rendered pursuit meaningless. He calculated the geometry in seconds, pilot's math done at 300 miles per hour, with perfect understanding of the answer. None. Let it go. Save your fuel, his wingmen protested over the radio. They could catch it. They could try. Klosterman was firm. It's too fast. We're wasting time and fuel on something we cannot catch. Let it go. He watched the sleek shape disappear into haze and distance, moving so fast it seemed to be violating the laws of physics. Made a mental note for his combat report. New German type. Unknown designation. Faster than anything we've encountered. Estimate maximum speed well over 450 miles per hour. Single aircraft observed. Recommend gathering intelligence on production numbers and operational deployment. Thank God, he thought, but didn't say over the radio, there aren't more of them. Hans landed at Oberpfaffenhofen 90 minutes later. Shut down the engines. Sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. He'd seen Allied fighters, been pursued, could have engaged, could have tested the WWII's combat capabilities against real enemies in real time. He'd chosen to run. Chosen to use the speed they'd built for survival instead of killing. Chosen to preserve his life and the lives of men trying to kill him because preserving life, any life, seemed more important than adding a few more bodies to the mountain of dead the war had already created. He found Jack in the factory that evening. Told him about the encounter in simple direct sentences: 4 Tempests, pursuit attempt, successful evasion, no shots fired, no casualties. Jack felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since Hans had taken off. Relief so profound it was almost painful. You could have fought. Hans nodded slowly. I could have. I chose not to. The war's over, Jack. We just don't know when yet. Why kill someone now? Why add one more name to the list when it doesn't change anything? It was the validation Jack had been hoping for without admitting he hoped. All the compromises, all the moral complexity, all the careful rationalization about keeping one man alive came down to this. Hans had flown the most advanced fighter in the German arsenal and used it for mercy instead of murder. The best weapon, Hans said quietly, is one that's never used to kill. This plane proved that deterrence, that speed could be enough. I kept myself alive without taking anyone else's life. That's what I'll tell my daughter when she's old enough to ask. They stood in the factory's fading light, surrounded by partially assembled aircraft that would never be completed, and understood that they'd succeeded in ways the Reich had never intended. They'd built a weapon so effective it didn't need to fight, so fast that running was always an option, so advanced that it arrived too late to matter militarily, but just in time to prove that engineering genius could be used for preservation instead of destruction. It was the closest thing to redemption either of them would get. March 25, 1945, brought redemption's price. American B-17As appeared over Friedrichshafen in the early afternoon. Dozens of them flying in the same formations Jack had once been part of, carrying the same bombs he'd once helped deliver. The irony was so bitter he could taste it. The air raid sirens wailed. Workers scattered toward shelters. Hans found Jack near the engineering section and grabbed his arm. "Come on, move." They ran together toward the underground shelter, feet pounding on concrete, the sound of aircraft engines growing louder overhead. Hans pulled Jack into the shelter entrance just as the first bombs hit. The world became noise, concussion waves that slapped the air from your lungs, the scream of metal tearing, the deeper crump of high explosives detonating. Secondary explosions as fuel and ammunition stores cooked off. The particular sound of a building collapsing, which is unlike anything else, a grinding roar that speaks of destruction on a scale that overwhelms human comprehension. Jack huddled in the shelter darkness and tried not to think about the fact that those were American bombs. American air crews, boys from Detroit and Iowa and Pennsylvania doing what he'd done 2 years ago, following orders, hitting targets, winning the war. The bombing lasted 30 minutes. When they emerged, the Friedrichshafen factory was gone. Just gone. Entire buildings reduced to rubble and twisted metal. The runway cratered. The prototype hangar collapsed. Fires burning everywhere, sending black smoke into the spring sky. Production didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not because the Reich still believed in victory, but because stopping meant acknowledging defeat, and the machine ground forward on momentum and denial. They shifted operations entirely to Oberpfaffenhofen, moved equipment that survived, transferred workers, continued building Do-3, 3.5s from parts salvaged and components shipped from other facilities. 11 aircraft completed, maybe 1 or 2 more possible if they could find engines. It was futile, everyone knew it, but futility had stopped mattering sometime around 1943. April 1945 arrived with spring flowers and the sound of artillery getting closer. American and Soviet forces were compressing Germany from all sides. The Reich was dying, thrashing in its death throes, taking as many people with it as possible. On April 19th, American bombers hit Oberpfaffenhofen. Jack was in the factory when the siren sounded. Grabbed his drawings by instinct, the engineering data they generated started moving toward the shelter. Heard Hans shouting in German, directing workers to safety. The bombs fell faster this time. More of them. The Americans were close enough now that they could send waves of bombers' saturation attacks designed to obliterate anything that might still be producing weapons. The factory took direct hits. Jack felt the building shudder, heard steel beams snapping. Someone screamed. Dust and smoke filled the air, choking thick, making it impossible to see or breathe. He stumbled toward where he thought the exit was. Couldn't find it. The building layout had changed, rearranged by high explosives into a maze of rubble and fire. His lungs burned. His eyes streamed tears that cut channels through the dust on his face. A hand grabbed his shoulder. Hans' face covered in blood from a cut above his eyes, shouting something Jack couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. Hans pulled him toward a gap in the collapsed wall toward daylight and air. They made it outside, collapsed on grass 50 yards from the burning factory, coughed and gasped, and slowly understood they were alive. The Do-335 program had just ended, not with a policy decision or military order, just with American bombs turning a factory into rubble. The next 3 days were chaos. American ground forces approaching, German military and civilian administration collapsing, prisoners being evacuated from some camps, abandoned at others, rumors of SS units executing workers to prevent them from falling into Allied hands, rumors of workers being released, rumors of everything and nothing making sense. Jack lost track of Hans in the confusion. One moment they were together trying to figure out what orders applied to them, if any orders still applied to anyone. The next moment, artillery was landing close and everyone was scattering, and when the smoke cleared, Hans was gone. Jack searched for 2 hours, called his name, asked other workers. No one had seen him. The test pilot had disappeared into the chaos of Germany's collapse. On May 3rd, 1945, American soldiers from the 7th Army entered the area around what remained of Oberpfaffenhofen. They found Jack Morrison with a group of other Allied POWs emaciated and exhausted and profoundly grateful to be liberated. A young lieutenant took his information: name, rank, serial number, where captured, how long imprisoned, any useful intelligence about German facilities or troop movements. Jack told him about the WWII, about the speed and performance, about the 11 completed aircraft and where they might have been dispersed. The lieutenant wrote it all down with the careful boredom of someone who'd heard 1,000 similar reports and knew the war was ending and none of it mattered much anymore. What about the German personnel, Jack asked. The test pilots, engineers, where did they go? The lieutenant shrugged. Scattered, some dead, most just disappeared into the civilian population. Germany's a mess right now. Records are destroyed. The whole administrative apparatus collapsed. Why, someone you knew? Jack hesitated, then nodded. The chief test pilot, Hans Weber. I work with him. I need to know if he made it. The lieutenant made a note. I'll pass it to intelligence, but don't get your hopes up. Most of the German technical personnel either died in the bombing or went into hiding. The SS was executing people in the last days. Anyone associated with the advanced weapons programs was at risk from both sides. Jack was processed through the liberation system. Medical evaluation, debriefing. Cleared of collaboration charges because he'd been a prisoner under duress. His technical contributions deemed minimal by officers who didn't understand engineering and didn't care to learn. By June, he was back in England. By July, on a ship to New York. By August, sitting in his father's machine shop in Detroit, trying to readjust to a world that had continued without him while he'd been building weapons in Germany. The war in Europe had ended May 8th. The Pacific War ended in August with 2 atomic bombs that made everything Jack had worked on seem quaint by comparison. What did it matter if Germany had built the fastest propeller fighter when America had split the atom? In December 1945, Jack received orders to report to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. The Army Air Forces had captured 2 Do-335s. They wanted technical consultants who understood the aircraft. Someone mentioned his name. He went because he needed to see it again. Needed to know the work had been real. That those months in Germany building something with Hans hadn't been a fever dream, born of captivity and moral compromise. The Do-335 sat in a hangar at Wright Field, looking predatory even when chained to the ground. American test pilots had flown it. Generated data. Written reports that confirmed everything Jack and Hans had calculated. 470 miles per hour maximum speed. Exceptional handling for its size. Control response better than expected. Single engine performance adequate for emergency landing. An American test pilot, a major with multiple combat missions, stood beside Jack studying the aircraft. Thank God they didn't build 1,000 of these, the major said. We'd have lost a lot of men. Jack said nothing, just stared at the sleek fuselage and remembered Hans Weber's voice talking about his daughter. Remembered late nights working on ejection systems. Remembered the moment he'd watched Hans land on one engine and understood that engineering could save lives even when building weapons. What happened to the German pilots? Jack asked quietly. The major consulted a file. Test pilot named Weber was assigned to this aircraft. No record after April 1945. Presumed dead or missing. Most of them are. Germany was a meat grinder at the end. Presumed dead. 2 words that meant nothing and everything. Hans might be dead. Might be alive and in hiding. Might have made it home to Stuttgart and his wife and daughter. Might have been executed by the SS or killed by Allied bombing, or simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany, where millions of people had lost their identities along with everything else. Jack wanted to search. Wanted to find Hans Weber and know the end of the story. But post-war Germany was closed to Americans, except military personnel and official investigators. The occupation was chaotic. Records were destroyed. And Jack Morrison was just a former POW with no official reason to be looking for a German test pilot. He went back to Detroit, took over his father's machine shop when his father's hands got too arthritic for precision work. Married a nurse named Margaret who'd worked at the VA hospital and understood that some silences couldn't be broken. Had 2 children. built a life that was normal and good, and haunted by questions that had no answers. Over the decades, Jack followed aviation news quietly, saw mentions of the D0335 in technical journals, read that one had been returned to Germany for restoration in 1960, saw a photograph of it flying at an air show trying to make out if the pilot in the cockpit could be Hans Weber, but the image was too small, too grainy. In 1983, he read that a Do-335 was being transferred to the Smithsonian, that it would be displayed in the National Air and Space Museum as part of their collection of significant World War II aircraft. Jack thought about going to see it, then talked himself out of it, then thought about it again. The cycle repeated for years. In March 1988, a letter arrived at Jack's house in suburban Detroit, forwarded from the Smithsonian, who'd gotten it from some German aviation association who tracked down Jack's address through old Army Air Force records and a lot of persistent research. The envelope was thin, German postage, return address in Stuttgart. Jack's hands shook as he opened it. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her husband of 40 years turn pale while reading a single sheet of paper. The letter was in careful English, the handwriting precise and slightly shaky with age. Captain Morrison, I have searched for you for 43 years. The chaos of 1945 destroyed records. I thought you were dead. You probably thought the same of me. I am alive. My wife survived the war. My daughter is now 48 years old and a doctor in Munich. I continued working for Dornier until retirement in 1980. I learned that the Do-335 we built together now rests in Washington at the National Air and Space Museum. They have invited me to give a talk about the aircraft as its last living test pilot. I have obtained a visa to travel to America for the first time. Will you come? I have something for you. A debt 43 years old that I can finally repay. Your friend. I hope I can still call you that, Hans Weber. Jack read the letter 3 times, then handed it to Margaret without speaking because he couldn't trust his voice. She read it, looked at her husband, saw tears on his face for the second time in their marriage. The first had been at their daughter's wedding. This was different. This was something breaking open after decades of silence. Who is he? She asked gently. The enemy who taught me that engineering has no borders, Jack said finally. That humanity can survive even in hell. That the best victory is keeping someone alive instead of killing them. He booked a flight to Washington, told his grandson Rick to bring the camera, drove to the airport feeling like he was 26 again, flying toward Germany in an uncertain fate. April 23, 1988. The National Air and Space Museum opened at 10 in the morning. Jack Morrison arrived at 9:30 and waited outside, heart pounding, feeling more nervous than he'd been on any bombing mission. He saw Hans at exactly 10:05, 76 years old now, silver hair, moving a little stiffly but still tall, still with the physical grace of someone who'd spent his life understanding how bodies move through 3-dimensional space, wearing a suit that was probably the best he owned, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. Their eyes met across the museum lobby. 2 old men who'd been young once, who'd built something together in the worst circumstances imaginable, who'd survived when survival seemed impossible. They walked toward each other, met in the middle, embraced without speaking because there were no words adequate to the moment. Hans was crying, Jack was crying. 2 combat veterans, 2 engineers, 2 men who'd seen the worst humanity could do and chosen something better, standing in an American museum holding each other like brothers. You're alive, Hans said finally, his English still careful but warmer, now touched with emotion instead of academic precision. I thought Jack started and couldn't finish. Thought you were dead. Thought I'd never know. Thought I'd spend the rest of my life wondering. I thought the same. 43 years, Jack. 43 years I've been looking. They walked to where the Do-335 hung suspended from the ceiling, stood beneath it in silence. The machine they'd built together. The weapon that had never killed anyone. The fastest propeller fighter of World War II that had arrived too late to matter militarily, but just in time to prove that engineering genius could be used for mercy. Hans touched the fuselage gently like greeting an old friend. This saved my life twice, he said softly. Once when I didn't have to use the ejection system because the landing gear you designed held under impossible stress. Once when I knew the ejection system would work if I needed it, which gave me the confidence to fly at the edge of the envelope. He turned to Jack. You gave me the gun. You gave me the ability to do my job and survive it. You gave my daughter a father. She has saved hundreds of lives as a doctor. Your engineering, your humanity, it echoed forward through time in ways you never knew. Jack shook his head. I helped build a weapon. Hans was firm. No, you helped save a life, and not just mine. Every time I could have engaged Allied fighters and chose to run instead, that was your influence. You showed me that the machine mattered less than the man flying it, that preserving life was more important than any tactical advantage. He held out the brown paper package. I brought you two things. Jack took it with trembling hands, unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small cloth bag in a metal plate about 4 inches square. The cloth bag held coffee beans, real coffee. The rich smell of it after decades of Folgers and instant coffee was overwhelming. Real German coffee, Hans said with a slight smile, as I promised in 1944. My wife roasted these herself last week. She lived, Jack. Because you kept me alive, she lived. She wants you to know she's grateful. Jack opened the bomb, breathed in the scent, remembered a factory at night and terrible fake coffee, and 2 men building an ejection system while dreaming about peace. The metal plate was engraved. The inscription read, "To Captain Jack Morrison from Hans Weber. You gave me the sky. I give you my gratitude." April 1988, Hans explained quietly. This plate was mounted in the cockpit of the WWII I flew, behind the pilot's seat. I retrieved it during the restoration work in 1960. I've carried it for 28 years waiting to give it to you. Jack turned the plate over in his hands, felt the engraved letters, understood that Hans had been carrying a piece of their shared history for nearly 3 decades waiting for this moment. Did you ever wish it had arrived earlier, Jack asked? That you could have fought, that the WWII could have changed the war? Hans answered without hesitation. Never. The best weapon is one that's never used to kill. This plane proved that deterrence could be enough. I flew the most advanced fighter Germany ever built and never fired its guns in anger. That's my pride, not the speed or the engineering. The fact that I kept myself alive without taking anyone else's life. They sat on a bench facing the WWII, 2 old men with nothing left to prove and everything to remember. Jack spoke slowly, working through thoughts he'd carried for 43 years. My father taught me to respect the machine, not who builds it, but you taught me something more important, that I must respect the builder too, that enemies can become brothers if they choose humanity over ideology. Hans nodded. And you taught me that American values, real American values, aren't about power or dominance. They're about compassion, about seeing the human in your enemy, about building bridges instead of bombs when you have the choice. Later that day, Hans gave his talk about the WWII to a small crowd of aviation enthusiasts and museum visitors. He was technical and precise, explaining the push-pull configuration and the ejection system and the performance characteristics. But at the end, he added something not in his prepared notes. This aircraft exists because of collaboration between enemies. Allied prisoners worked in our factories. They weren't collaborators. They were engineers keeping humanity alive in darkness. Captain Jack Morrison saved my life before we ever met by designing landing gear that never failed and an ejection system that gave me confidence to fly at the edge of what was possible. He gestured to Jack in the audience. That is Captain Morrison. He's the reason I'm standing here today. He's the reason my daughter grew up with a father. He's the reason I learned that the best engineering isn't about building the most effective weapon. It's about building the most effective preservation of life. The audience applauded. Jack stood embarrassed and moved, and understanding that Hans had just publicly absolved him of 43 years of guilt. That evening in Jack's hotel room, they talked for hours about their families, about what they'd done after the war, about the strange path that had brought them to this moment. Hans showed photographs of his daughter, of his grandchildren, told stories about rebuilding Stuttgart and working for Dornier on civilian aircraft, and learning that peace was harder than war because you had to face what you'd done without the excuse of necessity. Jack showed his own photographs, his children, his grandchildren, the machine shop that had become an aerospace components company, the normal life he'd built on the foundation of choices that still haunted him. I want you to know, Jack said finally, that I struggled with what we did, with helping you, with building that aircraft. I never knew if I made the right choice. Hans was quiet for a moment. Then there are no right choices in war, Jack. There are only choices that let you live with yourself afterward. You chose to keep one man alive. That man chose to preserve other lives when he could have taken them. Those choices rippled outward. My daughter is a doctor because her father lived. How many people has she saved? How many lives exist because you did the math on a landing gear strut in 1943? It was the absolution Jack hadn't known he needed. Not forgiveness because there was nothing to forgive. Just recognition that moral complexity doesn't resolve into simple answers. That doing something good while doing something questionable doesn't cancel out either action. Both exist. Both matter. Life is complicated and humans are messy, and sometimes the best you can do is choose the option that preserves the most humanity. When Hans left to return to his hotel, they embraced again, made promises to stay in contact, to visit each other, Jack, to Germany and Hans to Detroit, to introduce their families, to build in peace what they'd been forced to build in war. A friendship, a bridge across history, proof that enemies could become brothers, that reconciliation was possible, that the values America claimed to represent compassion and forgiveness and seeing the humanity in your adversary actually meant something. Jack Morrison stood in front of the WWII last time before leaving Washington. Rick had stopped filming, giving his grandfather private time with the machine that had changed his life. Jack wrote in a notebook, something he'd started doing after the war, as a way to process thoughts too complicated for speech. I met Hans again today, the enemy who became my brother. The WWII never changed the war. It arrived too late, but it changed me. It taught me that even in hell we can choose to build with humanity, that technical excellence and moral purpose can coexist, that the best weapon is one that preserves life instead of taking it. Hans lived, his daughter lived, his grandchildren will build the future. And in some small way, I helped make that possible. The Pfeil sits in a museum now, a silent testament to German engineering. But for me, it will always be a reminder that the best victory is the one that preserves your enemy's life. That mercy is stronger than violence. That compassion can survive even in the machinery of war. We built a monster together, and it saved us both. He closed the notebook, looked up at the aircraft one last time, understood that this was the end of something that had begun 45 years ago in a Bavarian wheat field. The end of wondering, the end of guilt, the end of carrying alone the weight of choices made in impossible circumstances. This story represents what the greatest generation understood. Jack said, speaking to Rick's camera one final time, that even in war, humanity can survive, that enemies can become brothers, that American values, real American values of compassion and forgiveness and respect for human dignity can transform the world. If this story moved, you share it with someone who served, someone who remembers. Let's preserve these lessons because they matter now more than ever. And if you have your own story of reconciliation, of finding common ground with a former enemy, share it in the comments. These stories are how we remember that we're all just people trying to survive with our humanity intact. The camera turned off. Jack Morrison walked out of the National Air and Space Museum into Washington's sunshine, his grandson beside him, carrying the weight of history and gratitude, and the profound peace that comes from understanding your life had meaning. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Hans Weber sat in an airplane heading back to Stuttgart, carrying an empty coffee bag, and the knowledge that the debt he'd carried for 43 years had finally been paid. The Do-335 Pfeil hung silent in its gallery, the fastest propeller fighter of World War II, too fast for war, but exactly the right speed for friendship. A machine built to kill that had become a bridge between enemies. A weapon that had won not through violence, but through mercy. Some call it the best prop fighter of World War II. But Jack Morrison and Hans Weber knew better. It was the plane too fast for war and just slow enough for humanity. The monster that saved them both. The bridge between enemies that proved engineering has no borders, compassion knows no flags, and reconciliation is always possible if you choose to build instead of destroy. That choice, that simple human choice to preserve life over taking it, echoed forward through decades and generations. Through daughters who became doctors and grandchildren who would never know war. Through coffee beans and engraved plates and two old men embracing in a museum. through the stubborn insistence that humanity can survive even here, even now, even in the machinery of war. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave and very human, survival is only the beginning. What you do with that life, how you use the years you've preserved, that's where redemption waits. For Jack Morrison and Hans Weber, redemption looked like friendship, like coffee and gratitude, and the profound understanding that the best weapon is one that's never used. That engineering genius married to human compassion can transform even the darkest chapter of history into something that speaks of hope, that enemies can become brothers, and that sometimes, just sometimes, arriving too late is exactly the right time.